Rachel Hayes stood at the edge of the Nevada training facility, watching other candidates struggle through drills she could complete in her sleep. At 29 years old, with delicate features that seemed almost too soft for military life, she kept her brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and never wore a trace of makeup. Her temporary training uniform hung loose on her small frame, the civilian candidate badge practically screaming that she didn't belong. For 3 weeks now, she'd been the ghost in the machine. While others marched in formation, she took notes. While they sparred, she observed. While they shouted commands, she remained silent. The other trainees had started talking about her. From day one, their whispers following her like shadows across the desert sand. This wasn't just any military training. This was the Interagency National Defense Initiative, where only the most elite candidates were chosen to bridge civilian and military operations. Every person here had earned their spot through years of distinguished service, advanced degrees, or exceptional performance records. But Rachel had simply showed up one day with paperwork none of them had seen before, and she never talked about her background. During breaks, she'd sit alone under the harsh desert sun, writing in a small notebook that she kept close to her chest. Her movements were economical, purposeful, but never showy. When instructors barked orders, she followed them without question. But there was something in her eyes at distance, like she was processing information on multiple levels that others couldn't access. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Rachel was standing near the equipment shed, checking her gear before the day's exercises, when she heard familiar laughter behind her. 3 female soldiers were huddled together, stealing glances in her direction. The tallest one, a blonde sergeant named Amanda Riley, with perfectly applied mascara even in the desert heat, wasn't bothering to keep her voice down. "What's she even doing here?" Riley said loud enough for half the courtyard to hear. "Seriously, look at her. It's like she's auditioning for some reality show." The other women giggled, emboldened by Riley's confidence. A brunette corporal named Lisa Martinez chimed in, "I bet she can't even carry a standard pack. She'd probably collapse after 50 meters. Their laughter grew louder, more pointed. Rachel continued organizing her equipment, her face showing no reaction. But her hands moved with the same steady precision they always did. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't slowing down. She just kept working. A group of male trainees had gathered nearby, drawn by the commotion. One of them, a stocky guy named Kevin Jackson with arms covered in military tattoos, squinted at Rachel like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "No, seriously though," he said, crossing his arms. "Who sponsored her for this program? Someone's daughter getting a free ride?" His comment drew nods from the others. Another soldier, younger with a crew cut that looked fresh from basic training, shook his head. "This is supposed to be elite training. We're talking about national defense. Here, and they bring in someone who looks like she belongs at a coffee shop." Rachel finished with her gear and turned to walk toward the training field. As she passed the group, she could feel their eyes following her, measuring her, finding her lacking. But she'd felt those looks before. She'd felt them her entire life. What they didn't know, what nobody at this base knew, was that Rachel had been trained by a man who was now considered a ghost in military circles. Colonel Marcus Thorne had handpicked her for a classified operation 3 years ago, an operation so secret that officially it never happened. Black Hades was what they called it, and only 6 people in the entire world knew the full scope of what it entailed. 6 people went in. Only 1 came back. Rachel still woke up some nights, hearing the voices of the 5 who didn't make it home. Still felt their absence like phantom limbs she'd learned to live without. But she carried their memory with her, tattooed permanently between her shoulder blades where no one could see it unless they forced her to reveal it. As she walked toward the training field, Rachel could sense the energy building behind her. Today felt different. Today, someone was going to push too far, and the careful balance she'd maintained for 3 weeks was about to shatter. The morning sun was already brutal, promising a day that would test everyone's limits. Around her, other candidates chatted nervously or ran through last-minute preparations. Word had spread that today's exercises would determine who stayed in the program and who went home. Rachel found her assigned position and waited for instructions the same way she had for the past 3 weeks. But deep down, she knew that by the end of this day, everything would be different. The question wasn't whether her secret would be revealed. It was whether she was ready for what would happen when it was. Lieutenant Christopher Hayes stepped onto the field with the kind of confidence that comes from never being seriously challenged. At 26, he was young for his rank, with a crisp uniform, perfect posture, and the bearing of someone who believed his own hype. He'd been watching Rachel for weeks, and it was clear he'd made up his mind about her. She was a weak link, a diversity hire, someone who needed to be weeded out before she endangered real soldiers. Hayes had built his reputation on identifying problems before they became disasters, and everything about Rachel screamed problem to him. "Attention!" Hayes shouted, his voice carrying across the field. Everyone snapped to formation, including Rachel, who moved with a fluidity that would have impressed anyone paying close attention. But Hayes wasn't looking for competence. He was looking for a target. His eyes swept the ranks and landed exactly where everyone expected them to. "Hayes," he barked. "Front and center." Rachel stepped forward without hesitation. She didn't ask why. She didn't look around for support. She just moved, her boots silent on the sand despite the speed of her approach. When she reached Hayes, she stood at attention, her eyes focused on a point just over his shoulder. The entire field had gone quiet. This felt like a moment everyone had been waiting for, whether they admitted it or not. Hayes circled her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Tell me something, Hayes," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone officers use when they're about to make an example of someone. "What exactly do you think gives you the right to wear that uniform?" He gestured at her training gear, the temporary uniform that all civilian candidates were issued. "This isn't a costume party. This isn't dress up. This is the United States military, and that uniform represents something." Rachel remained at attention, her breathing steady, her expression neutral. But inside, she was calculating. She'd faced interrogations before, situations where the wrong response could mean death. This was just another test, another moment where she had to decide how much to reveal. Hayes was just getting started. "Look around you," he continued, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Every person on this field has earned their place here. They've sacrificed. They've bled. They've proven themselves worthy of wearing this uniform." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell his aftershave. "But you just showed up one day with some paperwork, and now you think you belong here?" The crowd was growing. Other instructors had noticed the commotion and were drifting over to watch. Some of the candidates looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. This was military training. You didn't interfere with a superior officer. Making a point, even if that point felt personal and cruel. Rachel could sense the shifting energy around her, the way people positioned themselves to get a better view of her humiliation. She'd been in worse situations, faced more dangerous enemies, but there was something particularly cruel about this public degradation. "This uniform is worn by heroes," Hayes said, his voice getting louder with each word. "It's worn by people who've earned the right to call themselves soldiers. It's worn by men and women who would die for their country without question." He paused for effect, making sure everyone could hear his next words. "And you think you deserve to put it on? Because why, exactly? Because someone pulled some strings? Because someone felt sorry for you?" Still, Rachel said nothing. Her silence seemed to infuriate Hayes even more. He was used to getting reactions, used to seeing people crack under pressure. But Rachel just stood there, absorbing his words like they were background noise. Her calm was unnatural, unsettling. It made Hayes feel like he was performing for an audience that wasn't really watching. That's when he decided to escalate. "You know what?" Hayes said, stepping back so everyone could see both of them clearly. "I don't think you've earned the right to wear that uniform at all. In fact, I think you need to take it off. Right now. Right here. In front of everyone who actually belongs on this field." The words hung in the desert air like a physical presence. Even the instructors looked surprised. This was going beyond normal hazing, beyond acceptable military discipline. This was public humiliation, pure and simple. Rachel could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could sense phones being discreetly pulled out to record what was about to happen. This moment would be talked about for months, maybe years. The day the civilian candidate was stripped of her uniform in front of the entire training facility. But Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't protest. She didn't look around for someone to intervene. Instead, she reached for the zipper of her outer training jacket with the same steady hands she'd used to organize her gear that morning. The metal teeth separated with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. She shrugged the jacket off her shoulders and let it fall to the sand at her feet. Underneath, she wore only a plain white tank top. Her arms were lean but defined, marked with small scars that most people would assume came from training accidents. But it wasn't her arms that caught everyone's attention. It was what they were about to see on her back. As Rachel turned slightly, adjusting her position in the desert heat, a tattoo became visible between her shoulder blades. Not just any tattoo, a specific design that made several of the older instructors take a sharp breath. The Shadow Brigade. Insignia. A black hawk with wings spread wide, clutching a lightning bolt in its talons. Surrounded by 5 stars arranged in a pattern that looked random unless you knew what to look for. It was beautiful, intricate work, but that wasn't what made people stare. It was what that symbol meant. The Shadow Brigade wasn't a unit you could enlist in. It wasn't something you could earn through normal channels. It was a designation reserved for operatives who had completed missions so classified that their existence was barely acknowledged by the Pentagon. Hayes had stopped talking. His mouth was still open, as if the words he'd been about to say had gotten stuck somewhere between his brain and his vocal cords. Around the field, conversations died mid-sentence. People who had been leaning in to get a better view of Rachel's humiliation suddenly found themselves stepping back unconsciously, creating distance between themselves and something they didn't understand. That's when the footsteps approached. From behind, heavy, measured, carrying the weight of absolute authority. Colonel James Morrison had been watching from his office window initially, just keeping an eye on routine training exercises. But when he saw Hayes stripping a candidate in the middle of the field, he'd put down his coffee and started walking. Morrison was a man who'd seen everything the military had to offer. 30 years of service, 3 tours in active combat zones, commendations from every branch of the armed forces. He didn't get excited easily, and he didn't get surprised often. But when he saw the Shadow Brigade tattoo on Rachel Hayes's back, Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: recognition. And with it, a cold understanding of just how badly Hayes had miscalculated. Morrison's voice, when he finally spoke, carried across the training field like rolling thunder. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said, each word carefully measured. "Who gave you the authority to issue orders to a Black Hades operative?" The silence that followed Morrison's question was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that happens in moments of true shock, when reality shifts so dramatically that everyone needs a second to catch up. Hayes turned toward the colonel, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally dawning horror. Black Hades wasn't just a classified operation. It was legend. The kind of mission that got whispered about in secure briefing rooms, referenced in documents that required clearance levels most people would never achieve. Morrison continued walking until he was standing directly between Hayes and Rachel. He was a big man, 6 feet 4 inches, with shoulders that strained the seams of his dress uniform, but he moved with surprising grace. His eyes never left Hayes's face. "I asked you a question, Lieutenant," Morrison said, his voice deadly calm. "Black Hades operatives carry special authority under Section 7 of the Defense Authorization Act. They answer directly to Pentagon level command." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the field. "So I'm asking you again, who gave you permission to issue orders to this operative?" Hayes' mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Around the field, people were starting to put pieces together. The older instructors, the ones who'd been around long enough to remember classified operations from a few years back, were looking at Rachel with new eyes. They remembered hearing about Black Hades in briefings they weren't supposed to discuss. They remembered being told that details were compartmentalized at the highest levels. What they hadn't known, what nobody had known, was that one of the operatives was standing right here, disguised as a civilian candidate. Rachel herself hadn't moved. She stood at attention, her tank top clinging to her skin in the desert heat, the Shadow Brigade tattoo visible to everyone on the field. But her expression remained neutral, professional. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even looking at Hayes. Her eyes were focused on a point in the distance, as if this entire confrontation was just another training exercise she needed to endure. But inside, she was remembering the night 3 years ago, when she'd crawled through enemy territory for 12 hours to reach the extraction point. Remembering the weight of Marcus Thorne's body as she'd carried him the last 2 miles, even though he was already gone. Remembering the moment she'd realized she was the only one coming home. That's when someone in the crowd made a critical mistake. Kevin Jackson, the stocky trainee who'd been laughing at Rachel earlier, stepped forward with his chest puffed out. He was maybe 22, fresh from an elite military academy, still convinced that confidence could substitute for experience. "With all due respect, sir," Jackson said, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he didn't feel much respect at all. "That tattoo doesn't mean anything to me. Has anyone actually confirmed who this woman is? For all we know, she could be some general's daughter playing dress-up." Morrison's head turned toward Jackson with mechanical precision. It was the kind of movement that suggested violence was being held in check by the thinnest of margins. But before the colonel could respond, Jackson compounded his error. He strode toward Rachel, reaching for the folder she kept tucked under her arm. "I want to see some actual documentation," he said, his hand closing around the edge of the folder. "Anyone can get a tattoo. Anyone can pretend to be." Rachel moved. It happened so fast that most people missed the actual mechanics of what she did. One moment, Jackson was reaching for her folder. The next, he was face down in the sand with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that made several observers wince. Rachel had spun, caught his wrist, redirected his momentum, and used his own forward motion to drive him into the ground. The entire sequence took maybe 2 seconds. Jackson's face hit the sand with a sound like a dropped bag of cement. Rachel straightened up, brushing dust from her hands. Jackson groaned and tried to push himself up, but something in his shoulder wasn't working right. 2 medics started jogging toward them from across the field. Rachel picked up her folder, checked to make sure the contents were undisturbed, and resumed her position at attention. Her breathing hadn't even changed. Morrison watched this display with professional appreciation. He'd seen a lot of combat techniques in his time, but what Rachel had just demonstrated went beyond standard military training. That was the kind of fluid, instinctive response that came from years of specialized instruction and real-world application. "Medics!" he called out, gesturing toward Jackson. Then he turned back to the assembled crowd. "Anyone else have questions? About Operative Hayes' credentials?" The field had gone so quiet you could hear the desert wind moving through the equipment sheds. People were staring at Rachel like they were seeing her for the first time. The woman they dismissed as weak, as out of place, as someone's pet project, had just neutralized a trained soldier without breaking a sweat. But Amanda Riley, the blonde sergeant who'd started the morning's mockery, wasn't ready to back down. She stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Okay, fine," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. "So she knows some moves. So she's got some classified background. That doesn't change the fact that she's been freeloading off this program for 3 weeks." Riley's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fed by the desperate need to maintain some shred of dignity. "She's just some overhyped mercenary who got lucky on one mission." Rachel's eyes shifted to Riley for the first time all morning. It was a subtle movement, just her gaze tracking from the horizon to focus on the other woman's face. But something about that look made Riley take an involuntary step backward. Without breaking eye contact, Rachel reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Not the official documentation Morrison was expecting to see, but something else entirely. A tactical analysis map covered in markings and annotations. That looked like they'd been made by someone with intimate knowledge of military strategy. Rachel walked over to a nearby table where training materials were spread out and laid the map down carefully. The paper was marked classified in red letters across the top, with clearance requirements that made several of the instructors lean in to get a better look. "This tactical scenario," Rachel said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation, has been used for officer training at this facility for the past 18 months. According to the official solution manual, the optimal approach involves a 3-pronged assault with air support arriving at the 12-minute mark. Her voice was quiet, conversational, but it carried across the silent field without effort. She picked up a red pen from the table and began marking the map. "The problem is," she continued, drawing new lines across the terrain features, "the official solution is wrong. The approach they're teaching will get people killed." She looked up from the map and made eye contact with Riley. "This isn't theoretical criticism. I've run this exact scenario in the real world. The mission the official manual is based on." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 3 of my team members died because someone in a comfortable office thought they knew better than the operatives on the ground." The silence stretched out like a held breath. Morrison moved closer to examine the map, his experienced eyes taking in Rachel's modifications. What she'd drawn wasn't just a correction. It was a complete reconceptualization of the tactical problem, incorporating variables and contingencies that the original planners had missed entirely. This was about to become much bigger than a simple case of mistaken identity. Morrison studied the map for a long moment, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. What Rachel had drawn represented battlefield intelligence that could only come from direct experience. The kind of knowledge that saved lives, or, in this case, could have saved lives if it had been available sooner. He pulled out his radio and spoke into it quietly, using codes that most of the trainees didn't recognize. Within minutes, official vehicles were pulling up to the edge of the training area. Men in dress uniforms stepped out, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested this was serious business. One of them approached Morrison and handed him a sealed envelope. The colonel opened it, read the contents, and nodded gravely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of official proclamation, "I have just received an emergency directive from the Department of Defense. Effective immediately, Rachel Hayes is appointed as Senior Tactical Advisor to this training facility with absolute authority over curriculum development and operational planning. The words hit the field like a physical force. Senior Tactical Advisor wasn't just a title, it was a position that put Rachel in charge of the very people who'd been mocking her minutes earlier. She would be reviewing their performance, determining their fitness for continued service, making decisions about their careers and their futures. The irony was so sharp, it was almost painful to witness. Rachel accepted the appointment with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout the entire confrontation. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't even look particularly surprised. She just nodded to Morrison and said, "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best to improve the effectiveness of this program." But her first order of business was already clear. She turned to face the assembled trainees, her eyes moving methodically across their faces. When she spoke, her voice carried a new authority that made everyone straighten unconsciously. "The training scenarios you've been practicing are based on outdated intelligence," she said. "Starting tomorrow, we'll be implementing revised protocols based on actual field experience. The survival rate for missions conducted under the current training model is unacceptable." She paused, letting that statement sink in. "For those of you who make it through the next phase of evaluation, you'll be learning tactics that have been proven effective in real combat situations. Not theoretical exercises, but methods that have been tested when lives were actually on the line." Lieutenant Hayes, who had been standing frozen in shock since Morrison's arrival, finally found his voice. "Ma'am, I didn't know. If I had realized, you didn't realize because you didn't ask," Rachel interrupted. "You made assumptions based on appearances, and those assumptions nearly cost you your career. In the field, that kind of mistake gets people killed." She turned to address the entire group. "Military effectiveness depends on recognizing competence, regardless of how it's packaged. If you can't identify capability when it's standing right in front of you, you're not ready for the kind of operations this program is designed to prepare you for." The weight of her words settled over the field like a blanket. These weren't just philosophical observations. They were professional assessments that would determine who stayed and who went home. Morrison stepped forward. "Operative Hayes will be conducting individual evaluations over the next week. Her recommendations will determine advancement in this program." He paused, scanning the faces of the trainees. "I suggest you demonstrate the kind of judgment and professionalism that should have been evident from the beginning." As the crowd began to disperse, Rachel could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The people who had dismissed her as weak now had to prove themselves worthy of her approval. But the real consequences were just beginning. Over the next few hours, as word of the morning's events spread through the facility, careers began to crumble with surgical precision. Lieutenant Hayes found himself facing an immediate inquiry into his conduct, with witnesses lining up to testify about his inappropriate behavior. Military protocol was clear about respect for superior officers, and Hayes had unknowingly ordered a Pentagon-level operative to strip in front of hundreds of observers. The inquiry board that convened that afternoon didn't need long to reach their conclusion. Hayes' conduct violated multiple sections of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and his complete failure to recognize the authority of a classified operative raised serious questions about his fitness for command. By evening, his career was effectively over. Amanda Riley discovered that her mockery of Rachel had been recorded by multiple phones and was already making its way through military social media channels. The video showing a sergeant publicly insulting a Shadow Brigade operative reached her commanding officers within hours. Riley's sponsorship for advanced training programs was revoked, and she found herself reassigned to remote posting in Alaska, where her attitude would have fewer opportunities to cause problems. The transfer orders were marked permanent, with no possibility of reassignment for a minimum of 3 years. Kevin Jackson, still nursing his injured shoulder, learned that assaulting a Black Hades operative carried federal charges that went far beyond military discipline. The medics had confirmed soft tissue damage that would take weeks to heal properly, and every day of his recovery would serve as a reminder of how badly he'd misjudged the quiet woman in the ill-fitting uniform. His discharge from the program was immediate and permanent. Lisa Martinez and the other soldiers who participated in the morning's harassment found themselves under investigation for conduct unbecoming. Their social media accounts were reviewed, their training records scrutinized, their fitness reports downgraded. The military didn't tolerate bullying under normal circumstances, but when that bullying was directed at a decorated operative whose service record was classified at the highest levels, the consequences became career-ending. Rachel watched these developments with the same professional detachment she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. She took no pleasure in seeing people's careers destroyed, but she also understood that military discipline existed for a reason. In combat situations, the kind of snap judgments and prejudices that have been displayed that morning could get entire units killed. Better to identify and eliminate those weaknesses during training than to discover them when lives were on the line. But the most significant changes were yet to come. That evening, Rachel was summoned to a secure conference room where a video call was waiting. The faces on the screen represented the highest levels of military command generals and admirals, whose decisions shaped national security policy. Operative Hayes, the lead general, began. Your handling of today's situation has been noted. At the highest levels, the tactical analysis you provided has already been forwarded to training facilities across all branches of the military. He paused, consulting notes that weren't visible to Rachel. We're implementing your recommendations immediately. The scenario revisions you suggested will become standard protocol within 30 days. Rachel nodded acknowledgement. The current training methods would have resulted in unnecessary casualties, sir. Field experience should always take precedence over theoretical models. Agreed, the general replied. Which brings us to our next point. We're offering you a permanent position as Director of Tactical Training Development. You'd be responsible for reviewing and updating combat training protocols across all special operations units. It was the kind of position that could shape military doctrine for decades. The chance to ensure that future operatives would have the benefit of hard-won knowledge, lessons learned through sacrifice and survival. Rachel considered the offer carefully. After 3 years of living with the weight of being the only survivor, the opportunity to prevent others from facing the same losses was almost irresistible. I accept, she said finally, but I want complete authority to implement changes without bureaucratic interference. Too many good people have died because someone behind a desk thought they knew better than the people actually doing the fighting. The general smiled grimly. Understood. You'll have full autonomy within your area of responsibility. The paperwork will be processed immediately. As the call ended, Rachel realized that the morning's humiliation had ultimately led to something she'd never expected: the chance to make a real difference in how soldiers were trained and prepared for combat. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as weak had just been given the authority to reshape military training doctrine. Within a week, the Nevada training facility had been transformed. Rachel's appointment as Director of Tactical Training Development brought immediate and sweeping changes that rippled through every aspect of the program. The first thing she did was replace the outdated scenario that had cost her teammates their lives. The new training exercises were based on actual combat situations, incorporating the kind of real-world variables that academic planners often overlooked. Trainees who had expected to coast through familiar routines found themselves facing challenges that tested not just their physical abilities, but their capacity to think under pressure. to adapt when plans went wrong, to make life or death decisions. With incomplete information, the failure rate increased dramatically, but the quality of graduates improved even more. Rachel instituted a new evaluation system that prioritized practical competence over theoretical knowledge. Students were assessed on their ability to solve problems, not their ability to memorize protocols. The quiet ones, the observers, the people who might have been overlooked under the old system, began to excel. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the facility itself. The casual bullying and dismissive attitudes that had characterized the program were replaced by a professional environment where competence was recognized regardless of how it was packaged. Rachel made it clear that personal prejudices and snap judgments were not just unwelcome, they were dangerous. In a series of briefings that became legendary among military trainers, she demonstrated how bias could lead to tactical disasters. The enemy doesn't care about your preconceptions, she told one group of instructor candidates. They don't care if you think someone looks weak or strong, familiar or foreign. They care about results. And if you can't recognize capability when it's standing right in front of you, you're not qualified to train people whose lives depend on making accurate assessments. The message was clear. Competence would be recognized and rewarded, while prejudice would be identified and eliminated. The changes weren't popular with everyone. Some of the old guard instructors resented being told that their methods were outdated. A few trainees who had expected to advance based on connections or appearances found themselves failing evaluations they thought would be routine. But the results spoke for themselves. Within 6 months, graduates from the revised program were showing significantly improved performance in field exercises. Units trained under Rachel's protocols were completing missions with fewer casualties and higher success rates. The Pentagon took notice. Other training facilities began requesting copies of Rachel's curriculum. Military academies started sending their instructors to observe her methods. The woman who had been dismissed as weak and unremarkable had become one of the most influential figures in military training development. But for Rachel, the most meaningful change was simpler and more personal. She no longer woke up at night hearing the voices of her fallen teammates. Their sacrifice had been transformed into something that could save other lives, prevent other losses. She had found a way to honor their memory while building something better from the ashes of that failed mission. The quiet observer had become the architect of a new way of thinking about military training, one that recognized that strength came in many forms, and that true competence was often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. 2 years after that morning in the Nevada desert, Rachel Hayes stood before a congressional committee, presenting her annual report on military training effectiveness. The statistics were impressive. Casualty rates down by 30%, mission success rates up by 40%, and a new generation of military leaders who understood that competence came in many forms. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation had been cultural. The military had learned to look beyond appearances, to recognize that the quiet observers might be the most dangerous operatives in the room. Training programs across all branches had adopted Rachel's core principle: never underestimate someone based on how they look or how they present themselves. The Shadow Brigade tattoo on her back had become a symbol of hidden strength, a reminder that true power often remained concealed until the moment it was needed most. Military tattoo artists reported a surge in requests for similar designs, though few of the people who wore them had earned the right to display the original. Rachel's office at the Pentagon was modest and functional, decorated with commendations and photos from training facilities around the world. But the most prominent item was a simple framed photograph, 6 people in combat gear, taken the night before the Black Hades mission. 5 faces smiling at the camera, confident in their abilities and their mission. Rachel in the center, looking serious and determined. It was the last photo taken of the complete team. She kept it there not as a reminder of loss, but as a testament to the importance of the work she was doing. Every training manual she rewrote, every protocol she updated, every instructor she trained carried the potential to prevent another family from receiving the kind of phone call that had shattered 5 families 3 years ago. The knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. A young lieutenant entered, carrying a folder marked with the highest security classifications. "Ma'am, we've received a request from the Joint Chiefs. They want you to review the training protocols for a new classified operation." Rachel accepted the folder, noting the familiar weight of responsibility that came with such assignments. "What's the timeline?" "They need your recommendations within 72 hours. "Ma'am, the operation is scheduled to begin next month." As the lieutenant left, Rachel opened the folder and began reading. The mission parameters were complex, the risks significant, the potential for casualties high if the team wasn't properly prepared. But she had tools now that hadn't existed 3 years ago. Training methods that had been tested and proven. Protocols that took into account the hard-won lessons of the Black Hades mission. She picked up her pen and began making notes, each annotation potentially saving lives she would never meet, preventing losses that families would never have to endure. The quiet woman who had been publicly humiliated for not looking like a soldier had become the architect of a new military doctrine. The observer who had been dismissed as weak had transformed how the most powerful military in the world identified and developed strength. And in doing so, she had ensured that the sacrifice of her teammates would continue to protect others, long after their names had been classified beyond recognition. The tattoo on her back remained hidden beneath her uniform, but its meaning had spread throughout the military establishment. True strength didn't announce itself with bluster and bravado. It waited, watched, and struck with precision when the moment was right. Rachel Hayes had learned that lesson in the harsh desert of Nevada, where prejudice and assumption had been stripped away to reveal the deadly competence that lay beneath a quiet exterior. The military had learned it too, and they were stronger for it. In the end, the greatest victories were often won not by those who looked the part, but by those who had earned the right to play it whether anyone recognized them or not. The legend of the Shadow Brigade lived on, carried forward by those who understood that appearances could be fatally deceiving, and that true strength was often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.